everyone, and welcome to Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails, the weekly podcast that helps you grow your business, improve your life, and enjoy yourself along the way. I'm your host, Alan Langer, and every week we try to bring you the best thought leaders, the best business leaders, and the best minds out there to help you succeed in business and in life. So sit back, relax, grab your pad, your pen, and your favorite beverage, and enjoy the next episode of Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails. This is your host, Alan Langer, and we've got episode 57 coming at you tonight. It's hard to believe that I am at 57 episodes. It seems like I started this just a couple weeks ago. And tonight, we've got a really cool guest for you because this is the first time on my podcast that we're going to be talking about podcasts. I've got Heather Osgood, who's the owner of True Native Media, coming up in about 30 seconds. But before I get to Heather, just a quick announcement like I always do. The Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails podcast is marketingandSalesPodcast.com, the website, marketingandSalesPodcast.com. Don't forget the Ask Alan segment of the podcast. If you send me a question, and we've got a good question coming up for Heather later on, which I totally forgot to tell you about, Heather, but you're going to be able to handle it, so I trust you. You send me a question, I read it on the air, and you will get a free signed copy of my book. So we've got a question coming up from Maggie out in Fort Lauderdale, Florida later on. So without any further delay, Heather Osgood, welcome to the show tonight. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to dig into this fun conversation.
Yeah, and you were very, you stood out to me on LinkedIn because you're still, I'm sure there's other ones, but you're the only podcast person I've seen on LinkedIn. So we've kind of hooked up and you've helped me a little bit with some questions I've had. So I want to thank you for that. But before we get there, we have to talk about what you're drinking. And a woman after my own heart, it's 5 p.m. when we're recording and she's got a gin and tonic, right?
I do, yes.
I love it. This is a first for this podcast. I made myself an espresso martini. I told her. So cheers, virtual cheers into the camera.
Cheers, yay.
Thank you for joining me tonight, Heather.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get into this. So podcasting, you started this, 4 or 5 years ago, right? Your company?
Yep,
when podcasting was what it was. Now everyone and their dog has a podcast because of COVID. Tell us how you got into what you did and what you've seen happen over the last couple of years with podcasting and what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I sold a company that I had for almost 10 years. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't have a very full schedule. And so I started listening to podcasts. And the more I listened to podcasts, the more I felt that there were all of these very good shows that didn't have any advertisers in them. And I thought, why is that? That seems very strange to me. So I started to investigate the industry. And I found that the top 1-2% of podcasts out there had advertisers in them because, of course, they were huge names with very large followings. And I thought, gosh, there's got to be a market to sell ads on mid-level shows. And so I founded True Native Media because I had an ad sales background. And I figured, most podcasters really have no idea how to sell themselves and certainly don't understand advertising. And I really wanted to help those content creators. I had always been very obsessed with audio. And when I really discovered podcasting, which I would say was probably realistically in about 2014. Prior to that, when I had tried to listen to a podcast, it was very clunky and hard. But one day my husband said, have you ever listened to a podcast? You can go on this app on your phone and listen. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And there was so much great content out there that I really wanted to help support those content creators in helping them monetize their show.
It's funny. I'm probably a half a generation ahead of you. I don't know how old you are, but I remember we used to listen to shows on the radio. We would just turn on different shows, and that was basically the live form of podcasting prior to podcasting. So now it's just I just consider it sort of like the evolution of radio, but now it's more on demand. And oh my God, I got to turn my radio on at 4 p.m. because that's when X, Y, and Z is talking today.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was a kid, my dad would come home for lunch and he would listen to Paul Harvey. And I like
Yes.
to think back to those days because Paul Harvey did all of his host read ads, which is what we do in podcasts now.
Yeah.
And then I ended up in radio ad sales. But, yeah, absolutely. And to me, it's the best kind of audio because you don't have to tune in at a specific time. The content is always available to you. And there's so much variety out there, right? I mean, when we
Oh
were
my God.
limited to a certain number of radio stations, you had to listen to what was on. And
What
if you
was
lived
on,
in a
right?
small town like I did, it wasn't a whole lot.
And a lot of it was political. So you either listened to you were you're the right radio station or the left radio station. And, it just depends on, Rush Limbaugh or whoever else was on so it's crazy it's just amazing how much stuff we can consume today that's at our fingertips with podcasts being it. So do you see what I've seen in the world of COVID and the podcasting is I think a lot of people jumped into it because it was something else to do, but I don't see it. I don't know if a lot of people are coming out of it with longevity. It's like maybe it was kind of a novelty and it's falling off from what they wanted to do. Do you see that, or do you see a lot of these new guys sticking around from starting it during COVID?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And there's a term out there for it, and it's called pod fading. So pod fading is when
Really?
when somebody starts a podcast and they record, a handful of episodes and then they just don't do it anymore. And I heard a statistic fairly recently that about 35% of the podcasts out there are actively publishing episodes. So last I heard, there were 1.8 million podcasts. So if you figure 35% of those shows are actively publishing episodes, that kind of gives you a number. So it is very common. And even before COVID, it was very common for someone to start a podcast and then stop because I think, number one, it's a lot more work than people realize.
Yeah.
Number two, they don't have a strong enough motivator behind why exactly they're doing it. And then number three, most of the time they're not actually making any money or they're not able to see the tangible financial benefits of a podcast. So then they just stop. So I am sure we had so many. So we entered 2020 with less than 1 million podcasts and we exited 2020 with almost 2 million, right? So if you figure there were about, 600,000 or 700,000 podcasts that were started in 2020, I'm sure a lot of those people are not going to stick. A lot of them are going to fall off. But, that's kind of the fun of the medium too, right? Is that people can feel very empowered to go and start their own podcast. And, some of them will stick, some of them won't.
And also, when you're looking for a new podcast, I think people want to see the longevity. Like, oh, this guy has 4 episodes. Maybe I won't listen to that. Where this guy has, I'm at 57. Hopefully that gives me a little more street cred that this guy is, sticking around for a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. And the issue for me as a podcast listener is if I go into a show and I see that they have 4 episodes, how much variety is in 4 episodes? Right. Like I find it very common. Like yesterday I was, I had about a 30-minute drive ahead of me and I wanted to listen to one of the podcasts that we represent. And so I pulled up their feed and I scrolled through it until I found a topic that appealed to me, right? I found the show that I was like, oh, hey, and I mean, this is a show I know inside and out, right? But I wanted to find an episode that I thought I would really like. Turns out I really did like it. Bought the woman's audiobook this morning. But yeah, so it's just one of those things that if you go into somebody's podcast and they have very few episodes, not only can you bet that they really haven't put a lot of effort into producing it, it's not really going to provide you with the variety of content that you as a listener might want to consume.
So has there been, I'm sure there has been. So you're listening to a podcast and it's a popular podcast, so it has advertising. So you have the intro read, then you have the middle read, they stop and they take the pause and everything. Has there been studies done where do people fast forward through that stuff, or do they click through it like you can hit 30 seconds ahead or whatever it is on your apps? How do you avoid, as an advertiser, that happening? Is there a way to do that, or is there like studies that figure out what you're actually the advertiser actually getting in front of their audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. So research has shown that ads that fall in the middle or in the content, we call them mid-roll ads, tend
Right.
to have more traction than ads at the beginning. So if you think about your own listening experience, if you push play and the first thing that you hear is an ad, you've got your phone in your hand. It's super easy to fast forward through those ads, right?
Right.
However, if you are listening to a show and you're engaged in some activity, whether that's a chore or a walk or, driving, whatever it is, your phone isn't usually right in your hand. And so it's harder to fast forward through that ad. So those mid-roll ads tend to have better traction, which is kind of funny because when I started in the industry, it was like, came from a place where being first was always the best thing.
Yeah, right.
It's not in podcasting. The other thing is that in podcasting, there are two different types of ads. So you have the host read ad, which is the host talking about a product or a service. And then you have the pre-recorded, really programmatic ads that appear in podcasts. And programmatic ads aren't going to be nearly as effective because it doesn't have the emotional connection that a host read ad would have.
Right.
So from a results perspective, if you're an advertiser or a company and you're thinking about trying podcast advertising for the first time, ideally what you want to look for is content that aligns well with your personal brand as a company so that the hosts that are going to be talking about your show can be essentially brand ambassadors for you.
Right.
And then I would recommend listening to ad reads that they've done before. A lot of research shows that if the ad read is done well, people will listen to it. And if it's done poorly, then they're not going to. So if that host actually really loves your product and they have a level of authenticity, then it feels like a continuance of the content, which is why our company is called Native, based on native advertising, as opposed to an intrusive advertisement that we all just kind of are like, get me away from.
Wow. So it's funny because like my show, Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails, I've like, I hope they're watching because maybe they'll advertise on my show the tequila I'm drinking tonight. But I actually found this company. I'll even put it up to the counter. It's called Ben Shot. They actually make glasses with bullets in them. See that?
Oh yeah. That's awesome.
It's really cool. My daughter got me a glass because of my show. And I'm like, Ben Shot, if you're listening, I really love your glasses. So
you should
contact for them for me if they want to advertise. So I would be definitely a good ambassador for them. So
right, and that's the point. Like if you would talk about you're talking about them right now, right? They didn't pay you to talk about them. You just like their product. And ideally, we want to have as many advertisers partnered with hosts where they're like, hey, I'd buy this. And a lot of times I'm shocked at the number of our hosts where we get an advertiser for them and they're like, I like the product so much, I still buy it. And those are the types of hosts that you want to partner with.
Yeah, exactly. Because you want to, obviously, I wouldn't, and hopefully other hosts are like this, you would not use a product that you didn't like and advertise for just because they're paying you. So,
right. And to that point, I am shocked at the number of podcast hosts that turn down advertisers coming from,
really?
the world. Oh yeah. Like I was in radio and print, and man, if somebody walked up and said they had money, we said, great, how much and where do you want your ad to be? Right.
Right.
But it's amazing how many podcast hosts will be like, oh, I don't like that product, I'm not going to advertise it, or I don't think it's a good fit for me or my audience. And
wow,
it's
good
great
for them. Yeah, good for them. So when does it become, so podcasts are obviously finite. They have a certain amount of time. So therefore there's really, how many ads can you fit on a 45-minute long podcast? Is there a tipping point? Like we can't do any more than 3, or what is the normal rate with that?
Yeah. So it depends on what your perspective on it is. I have worked with hosts in the past who are like, get as many advertisers in here as you possibly can. But I would say that is the exception. Most podcast hosts have worked really hard to build their audience, and they don't want their audience to feel bombarded by ad messages. And so I would say that on average, it's most common for anywhere from like a 30 to 60-minute podcast to have 3 to maybe 4 advertisers. Okay. And usually if they're host read ads, they're going to be about a minute and a half,
Okay.
because it's not like, the radio days where you had to have a 30 or a 60 or a 15,
Right.
with podcasts, if you go to 62 seconds or 65, it's not going to hurt anything.
Right.
And
Right.
because of the more organic, laid back feel of the ads, a lot of times they'll go over a minute. But you do have to be careful as a host, because if your ads are too long, people are going to tune out. So I would say 3 to 4 ads in a 30 to 60 minute podcast is most common. And sometimes people fit more, but that's the average.
It's interesting that you said that. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I'm a big, I love to listen to true crime stuff, podcasts, really, really a big fan of that. And I ran into, by accident, a podcast that became wildly popular, but I listened to it when it first came out, like his first podcast, and it was Up and Vanished. With the I don't know if you ever heard of that. It was about the Tara Grinstead disappearance. And it was literally like, started in his living room. I'm going to investigate this disappearance. So it was kind of neat. It was like, I don't know how many people started listening, but it was like, he did a good job, but it was clearly his first podcast. And then he did his second one. And all of a sudden, he's now in the town interviewing people about this woman's disappearance. And he's getting the police mad at him. He's getting everyone in the town is mad at him. So now it's gaining popularity. And by the time this was done, he was on talk shows, and all of a sudden he's getting advertising. And I don't know, he probably did 25 episodes, maybe 30. And at the end, the advertising was actually too much. It kind of got to his head, I think. And every 10 minutes he was stopping for an ad while he was in the middle of telling, are we finding this woman? And then he did a second season, and I started listening. I did maybe 5, and I stopped listening because it was way too many ads.
Yeah.
So it was like, I kind of grew with him, like, wow, this is really cool. And then all of a sudden, oh man, he didn't really listen to his audience, I don't think.
Yeah. And I think it's a hard balance, because there is research to show that podcast listeners do not mind host-read ads. About 63% of listeners surveyed say that they don't mind them. And part of what I think is that we all want to buy products and services. And if somebody that we know, like, and trust is going to recommend that product or service to us, we're more likely to say, hey, that sounds great. One of the challenges is, like with true crime, for instance, it can be a little bit more challenging to match the true demographics of the listenership to the product.
Sure. Right.
So because it's more broad based, you're not going to say like, oh, hey, we're a health show, and let me tell you about this great supplement or this really cool new exercise product. So it can be a little bit harder to have that match. And so that might be part of the reason why it felt a little disjointed. And also,
yeah, that's a good point.
I think it really does depend on how many ad breaks you're taking. So from an advertiser's perspective, they like to be either the first advertiser or the only advertiser in a break. And so what I've seen some shows do is they'll take a show that's maybe, half an hour long. They put one ad at the beginning, one ad at the middle, one ad toward the end. And then it does feel oftentimes like you're interrupting the content a lot. Whereas if you did one ad break in the middle and you had 3 advertisers back to back, it wouldn't feel maybe as much like an interruption, because you would know like, hey, this is a block of ads. So I do think it depends a lot on how the podcaster chooses to format their show. And I also do believe that most podcasters do a really poor job of formatting their shows with ebbs and flows and natural breaking points so that you can more seamlessly integrate advertisers into it without it feeling like such an interruption.
Yeah. Like at this one show I listened to, I thought he did exactly what you said. He would talk. He would start the beginning like, this show is brought to you by XYZ, and that was it. Just brought to you by whatever the company. Then in the middle, he would sort of introduce the second part of the podcast. So when we get back, we're going to talk about this, almost like going to commercial break. Please listen. These sponsors, these next 3 sponsors, help this show keep going. Give them a listen. And it was sort of like, all right, I'll listen because I'm listening. And he would do 3 ads, and then he would finish it. And it was really good. I like that.
Mhm.
as a listener, that's something that I like, because I didn't feel like I was interrupted, and he prepared me to listen to the ads.
Right. Exactly. And I don't think that enough hosts do that. And I also don't think that enough hosts do a good job of saying, hey, by supporting my advertisers, you're supporting me, you're allowing me to create this content for you. So I think as a podcast host, it's good for you to essentially tell your listeners that they should support these advertisers and also spend the time that it takes to make the ad reads interesting to your audience so that you want to listen.
Yeah, yeah. And that just, it reminded me of, I've seen a little more of podcasters doing a like donation kind of thing, support the show by going to this website and making a $5 a month donation. Is that getting pretty common, or is that something that,
Yes,
what would you say about that?
it's very, very common to do that. Patreon, I think, is still
Patreon,
probably
that's it,
the
yep.
leading, platform to solicit donations. But I mean, gosh, I've heard stories where people make, $7,000, $8,000 a month off of their patrons. So, you can really ask your audience for that support. And usually it's kind of like a crowdfunding type thing where you're going to provide them with something, right? You're going to provide them with either merchandise or special episodes or special programs or special events or something, right? You're going to do something for them in exchange for that support. But as a podcaster, asking for support from your audience can be a very lucrative way of making money.
You got me thinking now. For the 4 people that listen to this pod, I'm just kidding.
Well, and I think too, like for someone in your shoes, you provide a lot of educational information, right? So could there be potentially maybe more educational information, or could you put together a package where they got a bullet shot glass and a t-shirt and a book, right? For, a certain level of support. So there's a lot that you can do.
Yeah. Cool. I might look into that. So let's get into the monetary side of it, both from the podcaster point of view and then from the advertiser point of view. So I know you and I spoke offline about sort of like what the minimum viewership or listenership should be for an advertiser to be interested in a podcast. So for the people who are starting or they have early podcasts and they maybe have 50 downloads a week or something like that, and they're thinking of monetizing or getting advertising, where do they need to get to realize, okay, I need to be here before I can even start thinking about getting advertisers for my show?
Depends a lot on how you want to go about getting advertisers. So if you want to get advertisers yourself, I think you can start a lot sooner. So there's essentially 4 different ways to go about getting advertisers for yourself. You can, or for your show, you can do it yourself. You can work on a marketplace, like AdvertiseCast is a marketplace that's out there where you just go and list your show. You could join a network. So a network is usually a group of shows within a similar topic, or you could work with a representation firm like True Native Media. If you are looking to join a network, be represented by an agency, or put your podcast on a marketplace, there's going to be some leveling that needs to happen, right? So like, for instance, at True Native Media, if I go to an advertiser and I say, hey, I've got these 10 shows, there's going to have to be some consistency, right? I can't have one show with 1,000 downloads and one with 100,000 downloads and one with 1 million. Like it doesn't make any sense. And same with rates, right? So I can't say, oh, well, this show with 100,000 downloads is a $30 CPM or cost per thousand. And this one for that has 1,000 listeners, it's a $300 CPM.
Right.
It doesn't make any computable sense to the advertiser. So that's why if you're going to work with an outside agency of some sort, you have to kind of play by the industry's rules, essentially. But if you want to go out and sell on your own, you can really do that almost at any point, right? Because, this show is all about sales. If you can sell someone on the value that you can provide them, you can do that, right? You can ask anybody for anything. Right. It's you selling the value of what you have to offer. And if you're selling it yourself, you can do things like, I think the best thing to do is package it. So you've got your podcast, maybe you've got some social media, maybe you've got a newsletter inclusion. What can you put together for that advertiser that's going to be of real value to them? And is the association with your podcast in and of itself of value to them? So if there are different ways that you can go about creating packages, that's the best, easiest way, I think, for you to monetize your show on your own, because you can set the price at wherever you want it to be. You could include things like sponsored episodes in there. You could make them a presenting sponsor where you put their logo on your artwork, right? The other thing that I have found is that oftentimes brands, especially if they're new to the podcast space, they don't know what a good number is, right? They don't know if 2,000 downloads is good or not good. Of course, you need to have some critical mass for them to get benefit. And I do think that is something that's important. One of the things I have seen over the years is that oftentimes people do overprice their podcasts, and ultimately the advertiser is looking for a positive return on their investment. And if you charge somebody $10,000, dollars to get in front of, 200 people, they're not going to get a good return on their investment, right?
It's not a good return right there.
No, so they're not going to ever come back. And ultimately, really what you want to do is create positive return advertisers, right? So you have to look at what it is that you can offer, what that value is, and then price it accordingly. And so, going back to your question and answering it, directly.
Oh, that's great. You're answering it. You certainly are.
If you, in my opinion, if you have 1,000 or more downloads per episode, if it were me, I would start selling advertising myself at that point. You maybe could even start at 500 downloads per episode.
Okay.
If you want to work with someone, or if you want to work with an agency, typically the very soonest that you would be able to do that is at 5,000 downloads per episode, or 10,000, like that 5 to 10,000 downloads per episode range is really important. So yeah.
All right. So that brings me to the next question, because as you know, I'd like to start monetizing this show. I don't think I'm at the numbers yet to do it, but it's slowly growing, and people are. I just get someone on social media say, "Hey, listen to your podcast the other day," so it's kind of cool. But how does someone like me, or someone who's just starting, how do you grow your audience? How do you start? I mean, do you have to have a specific person doing the PR? I know I could be doing more PR for it. I just don't have the time. What are some hacks to really help start growing a podcast audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually put together an audience growth guide. And if you go to
I didn't know that, folks. I see. I just asked that and she has it. Look at that.
Yeah. If you go to heatherosgood.com, up in the right-hand corner, there is a link and you can download the guide. And in there, I want to say we list like maybe 5 to 10 different ways that you can go about listing or growing your audience. So I would highly recommend, go download that. Okay. But the nuts and bolts of it are and because this is a marketing podcast, I would say you have to have a marketing strategy, right? You can't just create it and say, oh, people are going to find it. Like, I'm on iTunes, I'm on Spotify, people are going to just listen to the show. So I recommend putting together a marketing strategy for your show. And that could include things like, what are all of the different activities you're going to do in the next month, in the next 6 months to really grow your audience? Because if you don't have a very specific plan in place, you're not going to execute it, right? Like you said,
100%.
We would both love to think that you were a podcaster full time, Alan, right? But you're not. That's not what you
sound like I am, but
you do. But if you were podcasting 100% of the time, you would definitely put the energy into the show to make sure it was continuing to grow. So if you want your show to grow, you do have to put that effort in first and foremost. And then the next thing that I always tell people is that podcast listeners listen to podcasts. I do not know why, but there are a certain percentage of people out there who are not interested in audio content, which to me, it just blows my mind because I love it so much. But we know that people, right now, about 30% of the US population actively listen to podcasts. So what that means is that they have listened to at least a podcast this month. When we survey, the entire country, or what Edison Research has put together, is that 70% of US, residents have listened to a podcast once. Right. So we could say,
Wow.
oh, well, they're podcast listeners. 70% of the US listen to podcasts. And it's like, well, no,
Not
they
really,
just
right?
have listened to a podcast. That doesn't mean they listen regularly. So
Right.
if you figure 30% of the population is listening to podcasts, then when you get on social media, when you get on e-newsletters, when you get on YouTube and Facebook, all of these places, right? 70% of the people that you're reaching don't even listen to podcasts. And so if you're trying, to go to those places thinking if you put a whole bunch of effort, that's what's going to grow your audience, in my opinion, is not the best way to grow your audience. The best way is to look into the podcast ecosphere and then find how you can tap into those people. Because
The 30%.
exactly, that 30%. Because if I'm already listening, and I've had this happen to me several times where I'll be listening to a podcast that I'm kind of lukewarm on, and I'll listen to the guest and I'll be like, oh man, I like that guest. I'm going to listen to their show. And then I dart over to their podcast and I listen to their podcast. Right. So, so the way to reach that audience is by guesting. So if you can guest on other podcasts, that's a great way to grow your audience.
Yep.
And I always tell people, set goals for your go for it shows. Like, I really want to be on the Tim Ferriss show. That might be a little lofty, but just set goals for trying to get on big shows and see what you can do to get on those big shows. Other options can be running ads on other podcasts, right? So, what would it look like to run ads on Marketing Over Coffee? Or right, is that one? I can't remember. I think it's Marketing Over Coffee. But so are there other podcasts that you can advertise on? One of the things that is working really well right now is running ads on podcast players. So players like Overcast and Castbox and Castros, those players all sell ads that are those kind of, banner ads that stream across the top. And those can be really good places. So
are they expensive?
Depends on what your definition of expensive is.
Yeah.
I have heard that Castbox will guarantee you a certain number of downloads. And I want to say that somewhere between 300 and 1,000, I shouldn't quote numbers because now Castbox is going to email me and say, no. But yeah, I do think that Castbox guarantees that you're going to get a certain number of subscribers and will run your ad until you reach that. The other cool thing is that, those players, they're going to advertise your content within, to people who are already listening to podcasts within the genre that you're in.
Right,
so it's really targeted. And I think that it's a great way. So, really between interviews, running ads on podcasts, running ads on players, those are very good ways to grow your audience.
That's really, well, what you said about being a guest is so true. And I've been on so many podcasts, I can't even count, but I try to get on anything I can. And my philosophy is always if you get on a podcast and you find out that there's 10 downloads, most people are like, oh, it was only 10 downloads. And for me, it's like 10 more people than knew who I was the day before. So not a big
Absolutely.
deal. But I usually when I go on a podcast, I always end it by saying, if anybody emails me and mentions this podcast, I'll give you or the top 2 people, I'll give you a copy of my book. It also is a little test for me to say who actually listened to the end. And the very few times I've gotten the email saying, hey, can I get the book? I'm like, wow. So this person actually listened to the podcast all the way through. That's a great indicator. But I was on Donald Miller's podcast, the guy from Story Brand. I don't know if maybe I've told you this story. And Donald Miller has about 100,000 downloads a week, give or take. And talk about being on a big podcast. I only got on it because I was in Nashville when I met him, and I literally just asked him. I told him a story about my pricing strategy. He loved it. And then he actually said to me, I need to have you on my podcast. I went on that podcast. So usually when I'm on a podcast and it's a decent podcast, the next day I'll see 5 or 10 books are sold. Like the next day on Amazon, people buying the book. The next day after Donald Miller, 180 books were sold. The
Oh
very
my
next
gosh.
day, overnight. And
Right.
that entire week, I sold over 700 books until he went to the next podcast. So that shows you the power of being a guest if you find the right show that you can be on.
I think that you illustrated my point perfectly. And what I see, and to your point, I go on lots of podcasts because I think it's fun. This is a lot of fun, right? Talking is my hobby. So, but yeah, so going on podcasts is fun. But if you're really looking to grow your audience, going on podcasts that have 10, 50 listeners is really not going to help you, right? Going on Donald Miller's podcast, that's going to help you. So
it was amazing.
Yeah, if you can identify the podcast that you really want to be on, and then what I tell people, why did Donald Miller have you on? He had you on because you provided value, right? You told him about something that he was like, man, my listeners need to hear that. Yep. So if you find a podcast that you're like, gosh, I would love to be a guest on this show, look at their audience and think, gosh, what can I provide to that audience? And how can I illustrate that to the host? So when the host sees, hey, I want to give this information to your audience, they're going to be like, of course, that's a no-brainer. Like, you got to come on and share that. That sounds great. The mistake people make is that they say, hey, my name is Heather and I am awesome. You really need to have me on your show because I am awesome.
I get Nobody
it all the time. Cares how awesome you are.
Well, I'm on, I'm sure you heard of Podmatch, right? Podmatch.com.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I actually I'm not on it as a guest and I need to be, but I'm on it as a host and I get requests probably 2 or 3, almost a day. And you're right. I get the people saying, I could be on your show because I'm a great guest. That doesn't help me. How do I know you're a great guest? But the people are very specific saying, I can talk about how to structure your business, blah, 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 blah. Like, yeah, that can help my audience would be interested in that. I contact them back. So that's 100% true. Is Podmatch a good platform? Do you recommend using that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I enjoy it. And I really need to get on it as a guest because I've gotten a lot of good guests from Podmatch reaching out to me saying, or their PR people, people reach out to me. So
yeah,
I figure I made it a little bit when the PR people are contacting me. So
that's right.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. So it is time for the question of the week, the Ask Alan segment. And I apologize. I normally tell the guests what the question is so they can be prepared, but I am totally confident that Heather's going to be able to handle this question. So this question, Heather, is from Maggie in Fort Lauderdale. You're in Florida, right?
I am. Yeah.
How far are you from Fort Lauderdale?
I moved to Florida 8 weeks ago. I couldn't tell you where Fort Lauderdale is.
Where are you in Florida?
I'm in Sarasota.
Okay. Where'd you move from? That's pretty quick.
Yeah. We moved from California. We were on the Central Coast, kind of halfway between San Francisco and LA.
Wow. So one coast to another. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the East Coast time zone.
I like it.
Yeah. All right. So Maggie asks, do you think it's necessary to have a podcast? I can't read my writing here. Oh, yes, here it is. Do you think it's necessary to have a podcast to help you build your own personal brand? And if so, how niche should it be? It's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question.
How would you answer, Maggie?
I would say it depends a ton on where your passion lies. I was at Social Media Marketing World a couple of years ago, and there was a couple of gentlemen up on the stage giving a presentation. And one of the things that they said has stuck with me now, and I have shared the story with many, many people, but they got up there and they said, what happens most of the time with content creators is they're like, well, I've got to be on Facebook and I've got to be on Twitter and I've got to be on Instagram and I've got to have a YouTube channel and I've got to have a podcast and I've got to have a newsletter, right? So we say we've got to do all of these things. And then it's like, well, I guess I have to make a post today. I guess I have to do this. And so we create this content. And if you don't enjoy creating content, what makes you think that anyone is going to enjoy consuming that content? And I think that is so, so important.
Mm-hmm.
I love to talk. I already mentioned that. For me, a podcast is a very natural thing, right? If you are somebody who gravitates toward creating spoken word, then by all means, I would say a podcast is a very good way to create a personal brand. However, if you're like, it feels intimidating to me, or it feels scary to me, or every time I think about hearing my own voice, people say that to me all the time. I hate the sound of my own voice, right? We've all heard it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to crawl out of your skin creating a podcast, then, unless you're like, I want to face this fear and break through that, don't do it, right? Because if you're not really having a good time creating your show, people aren't going to have a good time listening, which means you're probably not going to get a lot of listeners, which means it's not going to help your personal brand. So my recommendation is really to identify with the types of content that resonate with you most and do the things that give you joy, because then that is going to be the true representation of who you are as a personal brand. And that's going to help your business grow.
Brilliant advice. See, you didn't need to know the question before I asked it.
Nah.
And what you said there is so that can translate over to marketing in general, because you're right. Everybody gets overwhelmed with, I have to do all of these things. And then you wind up doing all of these things very average.
Right.
You really want to focus on 2 or 3 things that you can do really, really well. Like for me, believe it or not, my top 2 social media platforms are LinkedIn. Used to be Instagram, but now it's TikTok. I tried TikTok.
Really?
And TikTok for me has been unbelievable.
Do you just enjoy it?
And not only enjoy it, but there is a professional aspect to TikTok that not a lot of people know about. There's a lot of professionals on there. And TikTok, more than Instagram, I get more engagement. I get people asking me questions and starting conversations on TikTok more than Instagram. So Instagram, for example, I've been on Instagram for probably 4 years and then maybe 2 years with my business. And I think I have 600 followers. I get 1 a week, 2 a week. I started TikTok in the week before Christmas, and I'm very close to 9,000 followers in 2.5 months, 3 months, not even. And the last 5 sales calls I've had last week and this week have all come from TikTok. And I would have never, ever thought about that. But if you can find something, first you try it, and if it works, stick with it. And now I'm like, okay, I'll do Instagram, but I kind of like whatever I post on TikTok, I just put on Instagram. And now it's LinkedIn and TikTok, and those are my top 2. Facebook is like, I don't even worry about it, and because I don't get anything from it, I don't enjoy it. So don't get over. Everyone says you got to do all these things. I don't have a newsletter. I don't have time to do a newsletter. And I don't think the time versus what I'm going to get back from it is not worth it.
Right.
I love doing the podcast. I know eventually it will be more than what it is now. And it's just like I told you at the beginning, it's growing slowly but surely. And I get a lot of great, the thing for me is people enjoy it.
Right.
Whether it's 100 people or 1,000 people, as long as they're enjoying it and tuning in, that's what kind of gets me going.
Well, and for a podcast in particular, it is different than social media, right? Because, and I'm right there with you. I love LinkedIn is my jam. Like, I just like it. I enjoy being on there. It doesn't feel like I have to, get all personal and do some deep philosophical thing, right? I just do my business, and I'm good at that. So, but the difference between social media and a podcast is a lot more work. Of course you could do, if you wanted to, like a 5-minute inspirational podcast, and those are out there, but how much is that really going to do for you? Right. Mm-hmm, and so if you're going to create, I would say, at least a 20 to 60-minute show, that's a lot more work than 5-minute post or whatever, even if you're sitting down and creating posts for a whole week. So you have to have a really strong motivator behind the podcast. And why are you doing the podcast? Because if you don't have that, you're just going to burn out, like we had talked about earlier, you're going to pod fade. So if you think you want to start a podcast, have a really good motivation behind why you want to do it. And, I have heard this over and over again. Sometimes the reason people create podcasts is because they want to interview really cool people, and they can only do that with a podcast. So it doesn't have to be that you're necessarily making, a direct income, or that you are, getting a certain number of listeners to your show. Those might not be the markers for you of success. So you have to decide, what does success look like for you, and why are you doing it? Are you doing it, like my podcast, the Podcast Advertising Playbook, is all about podcast advertising. I know not a lot of people want to listen to that, right? I don't have these expectations that we're going to get 10,000 downloads next week.
Right.
If we got 1,000, I would be stoked. So It's really determining, why are you doing it? And I do my show because no one is talking about podcast advertising, and it's something I'm really passionate about. And to your point, like, even if 50 people listen to the show and they find a resource, or they find information that's going to be helpful, then hey, let's do it. I'm totally down for that. Mm-hmm. And we take the podcast and create a whole bunch of other content off of those interviews, right? So it really depends on what your motivation is and what success looks like for you.
And here's the final thing that I would add, and because you're the podcasting expert, but I also found, from a selfish way, I don't do this a lot, but if you have a client avatar that you can advertise, you get a client. Like, let's say you want to cold call the head of a bank, and he's never going to take your call because you want to sell him some bank software, but you have a podcast about banking. You call someone, you would like to be on my podcast? He or she is probably going to say yes. And now you're in front of that client avatar, and now it's no longer a cold call, it's a warm call. So you can use podcasting that way as well.
Absolutely. People do it all the time, and I think it's brilliant. I think it's a really, really good idea to do a podcast just for that purpose.
Yeah, I agree. So, well, we are already at, I think I've had too much to drink already. I'm slurring my words. We're at 45 minutes. So I think we're going to wrap this up. But Heather, how can people find you if they want to talk podcast advertising, or just say hello on LinkedIn? Where do they go?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you just go to LinkedIn, I'm on Heather Osgood there. So look me up. And like you said, I'm one of the only people on there talking about podcasts, so not too terribly hard to find me. You can also go to heatherosgood.com, download that guide if you're interested in learning how to grow your audience. And if you're looking to discover podcast advertising more, whether you're a brand, a company, and you want to explore that, you can also go to truenativemedia.com and schedule an appointment for us to chat.
That is awesome. Well, Heather, I really thank you for being here tonight. This was fascinating. I think everyone in the audience really took a lot from this, because I know I've gotten questions like, how do I start a podcast, or should I? So hopefully this will help everyone. So I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed your gin and tonic. One more cheers before we say goodbye.
Cheers.
Cheers, Heather. And I want to say goodbye to everyone else. Thank you for joining me for episode 57 of Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails. Remember, go to the website, marketingandsalespodcast.com. Send me a question. And just like Maggie in Fort Lauderdale, she's getting a free copy of my book, signed by me on the inside with real ink and everything. That's it, everybody. We'll see you next time on Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails. Take care.